Hello everyone and welcome to another Learning Lunch hosted by Format Approved. My name is Brian Johnson. I'm the Senior Director of Online Education with Format Approved, and I'll be your moderator for today's Learning Lunch. We're joined today by Lori Morgan of Capco and Morgan, and our subject will be choosing and managing outsourced RCM. Today's session is sponsored by Care 360, and we'll have some more information about Care 360 as we go through today's session. But first of all, I'd like to thank Lori for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here.
All right, well, you can see Lori's extensive experience in this subject matter on your screen. She's authored books, she's done consulting, she's got quite a bit of expertise to share with us today, so we're excited to have her with us. Now, before we get started, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. I'll let you look at the questions we're going to cover today as we go. That's interesting. I'm going to let you look at the questions today while we go through. Let me close this. Apparently people can see those windows. Sorry, let me start over. So I'll let you look at the questions as we get into today's session. Sorry for that distraction for a moment. Now, people like to ask questions during these sessions, and that's a lot of what it's all about. So do feel free to ask those questions. We're going to tend to hold those questions until the end of the Learning Lunch, because otherwise it gets too messy. So do ask questions. We'll keep an eye on those as we go, although it won't be me. And then we will share those questions with our expert at the end of the regular presentation. The other housekeeping matter is that people always ask if they can get a copy of the slides and can they see a recording of the video to share with their friends. And rest assured that we will send that out to you via email after today's session. So that concludes our housekeeping. Let's get to the main part of our presentation. Okay, Lori, so what are some good and not so good reasons to outsource your billing? Give us an overview.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Brian. I actually really love this question because it comes up so much in the work that my partners and I do with practices, especially when they're thinking about outsourcing their revenue cycle management. And the thing is that a lot of times when practices are looking to outsource, they're potentially at the end of their rope and they're thinking, oh my gosh, I just have to get this the hassle of billing off of my plate and hand it over to an expert. And in some ways that's not really the best reason to decide to go ahead and outsource. So what I consider to be good reasons to outsource are to gain expertise that is hard to have inside your own practice. So for example, if you're a relatively small practice, you just may not be able to offer enough or have enough volume to support having even one full-time billing person on your team, or one or two billing people on your team, because really what you also want to be mindful of is redundancy, right, where you have backup in case someone has to leave the practice or go on medical leave, or they decide to take another job, or what have you. So these are very good reasons to think about outsourcing, right, because you can actually tap into more expertise than you can potentially justify bringing in-house, and then also get that redundancy that gives you confidence that your revenue and your cash flow are not going to be put at risk by someone potentially moving on to a different job. The other thing is that many times with a billing service, you can tap into a whole extra level of expertise, because even if you could afford to have one or two people on staff or could justify that with your billing volume, you may not be able to justify having a full-time coder, for example, and having access to a professional coder with that specialized knowledge can be really helpful, and many times outsourcing to a billing service lets you take advantage of that deeper level of expertise. The other thing is that even when a billing service doesn't have necessarily a certified coder on the staff, they'll just have seen so many more practices and so many more situations and so many more different payers that they'll bring a variety of experience that can be really helpful to your practice. So I think expertise and having that backup, that fail-safe in place, those are excellent reasons to outsource. And another really good reason is if you're short on space. So, for example, we've worked with practices that are either just starting or are starting to grow, and they want to add a provider, but there's not enough space. Now, you may be able to recapture some space by working with an external billing service that does not have to be in your office all the time. So that can be another really good reason. Now, the not so good reason is the one that I hinted at, you know, at the start of my answer, which is that just having this idea that you're going to get billing off your desk and it's not going to be your problem anymore is something that I think can be really dangerous, because you really need to work together with any kind of billing service that you hire. You know, in general, with any kind of outsourcing, I think that's really important. We've seen, like with larger companies, what happens when they've outsourced, you know, their telephone support to, you know, people in another country, and they don't really have a good handle on how that support is being handled, and what a frustrating experience that can be for you as a customer. And so, you know, you want to make sure something like that doesn't happen to your practice. I mean, because even though you're outsourcing your billing, it's still ultimately your responsibility. And to the patient, you know, when they talk to your billing service, they really feel like they're talking to you. So you really do have to keep your hand in it. And then the other thing is that teamwork in billing is so much more important than ever before, because so much payment responsibility now rests on the patient. And that means that your team and the front office, your schedulers, your receptionists, really have to understand a lot more about patient billing and patient payment responsibilities. And you're going to need to work together, they're going to need to work together with your billing service in order to maximize, you know, the revenue that you're going to be able to collect, and also do it while making sure that the patient has a really positive experience. You know, many times patients are confused about what they owe, and, you know, like just pushing them through their visit and not really discussing it with them, and then having them get a bill, you know, 2 months later, is not the best way to ensure that you'll get paid, and also to make sure that the patient has a positive experience. So for that reason, I'm always advising our clients to be sure that when you decide to outsource, you know, it doesn't mean that you're totally abdicating your responsibilities. The billing service really has to be thought of as an extension of your team.
Those are really great points, I have to say. And your earlier comments reminded me of parallels in so many other areas where you're dealing with practices that are, you know, they would benefit potentially from some outsourcing. I'm thinking here of like cloud storage, for example, cloud backup, where they may have, you know, a security person, for example, that they can have full time to monitor everything, the outsourced company, whereas it wouldn't make sense for practice to do that. And so the parallels with RCM and billing are really interesting.
I think that it extends to a lot of different things. Like we're seeing practices outsourcing, you know, certain aspects of their scheduling, for example, and you want to make sure, you know, that you know what the patient's experience is when they call in. And also there's that element of just, you know, you're going to get more attention if you're more involved with your outsourced partner. They're going to appreciate it too. You know, they want to know that you care about what they're doing, and that you're on top of it. So it's a little bit counterintuitive, but I think it's really important for any type of outsourcing.
Well, that's a great motto. Well, not a motto, but to the idea that if you do outsource, then partnership with that outsourced company becomes absolutely vital.
Definitely.
So how does RCM, you know, revenue cycle management, how does that differ from medical billing?
Well, so I'm so glad to have the opportunity to ask this question, because I think it's something that still is a little bit confusing. I mean, they're more or less the same thing, but this term revenue cycle management has kind of caught on in the past, you know, 3, 4, 5 years. I think it's been really something that the technology vendors have helped to propagate. The idea being that there's a whole cycle of billing. It's not just, oh, we're going to send the bills out and the money comes in. And I actually really like this idea of revenue cycle management versus simply saying medical billing, because as I mentioned, with the first question, billing has gotten to be so much more complicated on the patient side, and the revenue cycle, I mean, I like to say the revenue cycle really starts when the patient books their appointment, because at that point it's really important to start letting the patient know, you have a deductible or you have a copay. These are going to be your payment obligations when you come in. These are the options that we have to make it easier for you to pay, et cetera. And so that kind of it kind of spotlights the fact that it's not just a single process. There are many steps that happen, and it kind of goes in a cycle. So I like that that term, but many people still just say medical billing, and in many ways they're sort of interchangeable. Just with the caveat that we're not just talking again about sending stuff out to your billing service and it's off of your plate. There's really more to it than just sending in those claims to your insurance company. The other thing that I really like about the term revenue cycle management is the idea that it kind of does bring in the importance of technology, which I'm going to we'll get to, I'm sure, as we with an upcoming question. But technology has become more and more important in bringing in revenue to your practice, and so I like the idea that the term revenue cycle management spotlights technology and also reinforces this idea that this is a multi-step process, and really everyone in the front office of the practice, as well as at your RCM partner, needs to understand their role in it.
Well, I think that's also an important point. I have to say that in my own experiences with doctors, I have not always had very much explanation of the bill, and I think that's a universal experience.
I totally agree, but it's changing. I feel like practices are getting better at it, but it's it's something that
it's new in a way.
It's new, and I think they also correctly feel like, well, wait a minute, why is it my job to explain? Right. The health insurance, they should be getting that information from their benefits department or from the health plan, but the reality is they're not getting enough good information, and so it kind of falls into the lap of the practice, even though it shouldn't really be their job.
Absolutely. That is a great point. It is. It's unfortunate that the doctors are kind of left, having to explain people's insurance to them sometimes, but the insurance companies don't do a great job of it, that's for sure.
That's exactly right. And if you don't explain it, then the patient could potentially be surprised or upset, or lots of consequences on top of potentially not paying the bill as well. So right. It's falling into our laps that we have to deal with, even though it shouldn't be our job.
But it is the reality, as you said. So we've touched on this question earlier, but let's dive a little deeper on it. Does specialty or coding experience matter? I'm pretty sure the answer is yes, but explain that to us if you could.
Well, you know what? I'm glad to dive a little deeper on it because it can matter. It can certainly be helpful, but in most cases, it's not essential. A lot depends on what your specialty is and, how complicated it is and how many coding issues you are currently experiencing. Certainly having the access to a coder on staff at a revenue cycle management firm can be a big plus, right, because you do have someone you can go to with any questions, and that can be really helpful, especially at the beginning of the year when some of the coding requirements change. But, the other thing that you might want to think about is not having certified coders per se, but just having someone who has experience billing for your specialty. Now, if you are in your rather niche specialty, a kind of narrow specialty, this can be very important. We worked with a practice a couple of years ago that where it's basically a solo practice where it's a vascular surgeon who works on leg veins, and most of the time, probably 60% of the time, he works on both legs. But when they switched to a new billing service, the person working on the account did not have experience with this type of procedure, and she thought that the requests that she was getting for the second leg were duplicate. And early on in the process, a payer rejected a claim, and so she thought that that the payer was right, and this was just a duplicate submission, and of course it was made more confusing by the fact that they were still using paper to transmit the billing information over the billing service. And so that's a case where if that biller had had experience with that particular specialty, I think that error would have been caught much more quickly. I mean, it took months before, it was going on for months before we arrived on the scene, and it took months before the doctor figured out what was going wrong. And so, that's one example where specialty experience can help a biller get up to speed more quickly. But I will say this, even when you have a rather, tightly defined specialty like that vascular surgery practice, what's really more important than having specific experience with that specialty is the commitment to learning. And also to know a little bit about the process that the biller that you'll be working with took in previous situations when they had to actually get up to speed quickly on a new specialty. That's really the most important thing, because you know what, I mean, our whole world continues to evolve, and there are all kinds of changes happening in the reimbursement world, and so you really want to work with a billing service that has that commitment to continuing to develop their skills and continuing to learn.
That's interesting. So was that example about the specialty, I'm not sure I completely understood it, was that related to ICD-10 that then they had to do laterality on the leg and they weren't used to that? Was that part of it, or am I misunderstanding?
No, it wasn't. It was before ICD-10 actually, and
okay.
So what was happening was that the information was identical except for having left or right leg, and the payers are often very quick to just reject something, as I'm sure anyone listening on this call could
reject
totally
first,
verify.
ask questions later.
Yeah. So what happened was that they thought it was a duplicate, and I can't remember if there was there's probably a modifier that was missing also. Mm-hmm. So, but the source of the confusion was that the biller basically submitted the claim identically, and the payer rejected it, and she just assumed that the doctor was, sending in duplicates to her. Yeah, exactly. And so it's definitely something. They lost a couple of months of the second leg for many of those patients. Now, the payers pay less on the second. It was quite a hit. So, I mean, that's a rather extreme example, but things like that can happen, and if it takes too long for the biller to get to speed, then, you can miss a timely filing limit potentially. So, it's not, in my opinion, specialty experience, it's not always crucial. I mean, you really want to know, though, that the biller has the ability and the mindset to learn how to handle anything that's specific to your specialty.
And I think that's a great point, that it's not like now that we've switched over to ICD-10 that things are going to be set in stone. It's a continually evolving system.
Absolutely. And the CBT side, too. And I think there's lots of evolving that's happening with quality, for example, quality metrics and all that. So yeah, we all have to keep learning, basically.
Right. Okay, well, let's look more at technology then, because you mentioned that earlier. Why is technology important in dealing with these issues?
Well, first and foremost, I think when you make the decision to switch to a new billing service, you're kind of at a crossroads where you can also upgrade your practice management system if it needs it, and if you want to do that. And if you're not happy, I think this is like a great opportunity, because usually what happens when you switch either from in-house billing to a billing service or from one billing service to another, you're going to need to set a point in time where you're taking a break, and the new service is taking over your billing from that certain point, and your prior service or your in-house team is likely going to be still working the receivables from before that point. So you have an opportunity to make a conversion in a relatively clean way. And so, I recommend that if you're not happy with the practice management system that you've got, this is a chance to upgrade and also get some good feedback because these billing services and professional billers will have some insight into which systems work really well and have features that you can benefit from. Now, the other thing that I think is so hugely important is that if you are not already working on an integrated system where information is being transferred from your EHR to the practice management system and vice versa, here's an opportunity for you to look into that. And integration gives you so many advantages. That example that I just mentioned about the vascular surgeon, if they had been using an integrated system, instead of writing his billing information down on a daily sheet and sending it over, there would have been much less likelihood of that kind of error happening, because it would have been all coming to the billing service straight out of the EHR. So, having that level of integration, it really reduces the likelihood of a mistake happening. It makes it, you don't have to worry about being able to read what someone wrote, for example, and there's no double entry to do. So the billing service can get your claims in a lot more quickly if you have integration. So if you don't already have a system on the practice management side that's integrated with your EHR, here's your chance to look for that. Now, there are many levels of integration, and lots of times practices assume that they can only get it by going with a vendor that offers both the EHR and the practice management system. But the reality is that all of the practice management system vendors and all the billing services that are offered, inside of those technology companies, they're all working harder to offer at least some integration with EHRs that are not, their own EHRs. So don't assume that you won't be able to get any integration without switching to EHR and practice management system on the same platform. Always something that you should ask about. The other thing is that, it's amazing the amount of innovation and improvement there has been on the reporting side. Today's practice management systems are so much better, even than the ones that we commonly saw in practices, 5, 6 years ago. And so if you're not getting all the reports that you need, you really, this is your chance, right, to switch to a system that gives that to you. You can see this little graphic. This is from Fitbit. This is their little dashboard that you have if you use Fitbit. A good practice management system should be able to give you a little dashboard like that just shows you a daily snapshot of how your revenue cycle is proceeding. And if you work with a revenue cycle management firm that is cloud-based, you should be able to have access to that dashboard and those metrics without asking the billing service for it. So this is like a chance to really get to this much higher level of reporting and productivity. The other thing to keep in mind is that your practice management system is the platform for all of your front office technology. So, for example, if you want to start adding things in the scheduling or the front desk where people can use a payment estimator, for example, to help them figure out how much a patient is actually going to have to pay. Those little bits of add-on software are going to connect into your practice management system. And so, taking this chance to upgrade and choose a practice management system that really meets your needs, it's also your chance to potentially look at some of these other add-on components that could be helpful for your practice.
Well, that's great information.
I'm sorry, Brian.
No, go right ahead.
So sorry. No, I was just going to say that, there's a lot of innovation, definitely a good time to be out there shopping.
I was just going to say that I was not aware of the efforts that it's realistic to integrate practice management software with another EHR these days, or at least it's possible. I've heard that it's possible, but I didn't realize that they've made strides in that realm.
Well, there definitely are some trade-offs. I think the very best integration usually happens when they're both from the same vendor, but
sure,
there can be enough to make a big difference. So, it's just something to ask about, especially if you're really happy with your EHR and don't want to change, but want to change your practice management system.
Well, that's interesting. I'm more familiar with EHRs in general than practice management software, so I'm sure there's a lot of people out there who aren't aware of the fact that they've made some big improvements in the last few years. So that's good to know. So what are some questions then as people are shopping around and they're trying to figure out what they should do for RCM services? What do they need to ask the vendor?
Well, aside, of course, from the technology, which you just talked about, I think that it's really important to start by asking about how the two teams will work together, because I've already mentioned that I think it's really important that you be ready for your team to stay involved with theirs, and you want to make sure that they have that same attitude. So that's one of the things that I would focus on first. Also, how is the patient billing side of things going to be handled? I mean, are we going to work together on handling phone calls, for example? You really need to understand the mechanics of how you're going to work together day to day. And if you're considering more than one service, here's your chance to kind of compare their philosophies, about how the revenue cycle team should work together with your own team. The other thing is that there are just little operational details that you want to make sure you understand how they'll be processed, like for example, the amendments that payers are constantly sending out, and renewal of your contracts, and all that sort of communication that's coming from payers. How are you going to make sure that not just your staff, but also administrators and managers are staying looped in on that, because you don't necessarily want your billing service to be making decisions for you, which happens a lot when the billing service either can't, doesn't have a good communication, system, if you will, set up with the practice, and they're sort of left in the dark, and they don't know what to do with the amendments that are coming over, or with the notices about contracts needing to be renewed. So how are you going to make sure that you don't lose touch on those important issues? And how are you going to, are you going to retain control of those things, or are you going to ask for the billing services help and advice with those types of things? The other thing is, how do you approach problem accounts? I mean, there are, your revenue cycle management partner is going to be very focused on bringing in as much revenue as they possibly can in most cases, because it's typical that they will be compensated based on a percentage of what they collect. So you want to know, well, what are they going to do about problem accounts? Is that, are they going to be as aggressive in chasing those? And also, how are you going to get information from them about problems that keep coming up, for example, with a particular payer? I mean, this is stuff that you need to know, right, when it comes to renewal time. If a particular payer is constantly constantly creating hassles, this is information that you need. So I think understanding the process for dealing with problem accounts, knowing that they're not going to be just put aside because they're too much work, is really important. You also want to make sure that you still have control over how patient interactions are handled. And one of the most important things is what happens when a patient account becomes past due. What would be the billing service's normal process for dealing with accounts that have to go out to a collection agency? Now, you may have your own philosophy about that, and you may already have your own, even your own collection agency in place. And so that's something you need to work out with them, right? Because a lot of times doctors don't want to ever send their account doc collections, or they want to make sure that the process is handled really gently. So that's something where you want to really be able to talk that through and maintain some control over that. And then, of course, credentialing has gotten a little bit easier in recent years, but it's still a fair bit of work. And if you add a new provider, or you're wanting to add a new plan, you want to know if the billing service is going to be able to handle that for you.
So what are some kind of hidden pitfalls or things to really pay attention to when it comes to contracts?
Well, so there are a lot. So one thing I always recommend is that if you're looking at multiple services, sometimes you can even get a copy of the boilerplate contract before you get too far along in considering them. And every organization has its own approach to contracts. In some cases, they're just trying to make it as easy as possible to get people signed on, and so the contracts do not have too many gotchas in them.
Mm-hmm.
But in other cases, the organization puts out a contract that is basically the very best for them, with the expectation that you will negotiate some things and that you will want to change some things. So, until you see that contract, you don't really know what, how much it's going to be like the first version or the second version, right? So you really have to review the contract carefully. And, these are just a few. I have listed here on the slide just a few of the pitfalls that frequently come up. So, for example, data ownership. You want to make sure that it's absolutely clear that you are actually the owner of your data, meaning that if you decide to switch to another service, your data goes with you. And this is just something that you really have to watch out for. You want to know what the term and the termination policies are, right? Because if you do decide to switch, you want to know how much notice you have to give, and you want to know how long the terms of this contract apply for. What happens at the end? Does it automatically renew, or do you have to actually go through a process to renew? And if it automatically renews, does that mean that your fee schedule stays the same? So that's something always to look at closely. Indemnification. So you want to make sure that if there's indemnification in there, for you, right, they want to be indemnified in the event that someone in your practice does something wrong, or there's some form of fraud that they couldn't have prevented. You also want the same thing from them. So you want to have that go in both directions. You also want to know how the cash flows. Now, this is less common now, but it used to be not uncommon for billing services to actually collect the money and then transfer it over to the practice. This is not the best way to go about it. What you want to have happen is you want that money to be direct deposited into your own account, and you want to have electronic funds transfer set up with all of your different payers. And you also need to know, is the billing service going to help you with the process of setting that up? But with respect to the contract and the cash flow, it needs to be clear that the funds are all going directly to your practice. You also want to know, are you going to have a dedicated contact? That's something that I think is really important. And if they've agreed to do that for you, make sure it's in the contract. Now, one thing I will say, oftentimes you'll talk with a sales rep or talk with the owner of the billing service, and you'll discuss certain things that things that are important to you that the billing service is committing to providing, and those may not be listed in the boilerplate contract. So make sure that you get those added. Right? Remember that you can ask them to add things, and if they've agreed to it, they shouldn't have a problem with putting it in as an addendum to the contract. Now, one other thing I always say, so when it comes to contracts, there's a legal element and there's a business element. With the legal element, you need to get your advice from a lawyer. And if there's anything in there at all, any language that seems confusing to you or that you aren't clear on, make sure you get your lawyer to take a quick look at it. With a billing service contract, they're not usually that long, and it shouldn't be too expensive to have an attorney look at it for an hour or so. And well worth it for your peace of mind. But besides legal advice, there's also a business side to a contract. And, lawyers don't usually have the experience in the field on the business side of things. So, for example, the issues of data ownership and things, not all attorneys will be aware of how important that can be, or termination, how soon will you get your data out of the system if you decide to move on. These are more business and operational type issues, and if you need help analyzing those, that's definitely something you should get some outside advice on too. The other thing is that, we're going to get to the pricing model a little bit further into this talk, but just with respect to your contract, of course, you want to make sure that whatever fee schedule you've agreed to is reflected accurately in the contract, and that you go through, if you're comparing two different options, that you go through using your current your current charges and your current collection rates to figure out what the actual cost is of one service versus another, because usually there's a mix, right, of percentage payment, and then maybe a flat rate might be in play as well, especially if you're a smaller practice. So make sure on the business side you're really working through the impact of all the terms, and then if there are questions about the terminology or anything legal, always worth it to have an attorney take a look.
That is just, I thought that was a gold mine of good advice. I have to say that was
Oh,
great.
thank you.
Because as you know,
Thank
on the
you.
legal side of things, like when it comes to things like indemnification language, you need a lawyer to look at that because it's got to be right. It just
Yep,
you
I
can't come
completely
in as
agree.
a civilian and say, oh, I've covered all my bases. But the other point you made about the business side of things and not expecting the attorneys to understand those issues, that's also huge. I completely agree with you there that, sometimes people think that a lawyer is going to understand the business that they're in, and they really don't usually understand anything about it. And so you can't expect them
Yep.
to take care of those business elements. That's really on you.
I think it's an important point too, because we actually have seen practices, make decisions that maybe they wouldn't have otherwise made because they only listened to legal advice and didn't really get any business input, and they weren't
Hmm.
familiar with the type of arrangement they were, setting out on. So yeah, I think it's really important, and I think that a lawyer is always going to want to try to help you with everything. I mean,
Sure.
just as a matter of good service. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they are the most expert in the business side of it.
Right. Absolutely. And then just to touch on that first point one more time, that data ownership issue, that is such a huge issue across the medical field. And
Hmm.
it really is so important that people own their data because otherwise if something goes
Absolutely.
wrong with that provider, you're in big trouble.
Yeah, and it can be really hard if you want to set out, if you're part of a larger group and you want to set up a new practice or something like that, and finding out that you don't own your data, that can be a huge shock and frustration.
Absolutely. So what reports are provided? What should people expect? And how should services grade themselves?
Well, so these are some of the things in the first bullet. These are some of the things that I think are really important to look at. These days we're paying more attention than ever to aging of accounts receivables because of the shift to high deductible plans. And so this plays out in a lot of different ways, but one is, with reporting, you want to make sure you know which receivables are getting out there 60, 90 days, and also the breakdown of patient receivables versus payer receivables, because the patient receivables can become a much bigger problem. And this kind of ties back to working together, right? The billing service team working together with your team. You want to keep an eye on this aspect of the business that you need to really collaborate on and make sure that the system is working. I will say, actually, with respect to this whole issue of reports, one thing I want to point out is that if you work with a cloud-based practice management system, one of the more modern ones, if you're not on one already, this is your chance to switch to one. You should be able to have access to these reports whenever you want them and not necessarily have to wait for the billing service to provide reports to you. Now, many times, just as a matter of good customer service, your billing service will provide you with monthly reports anyway, even though you have access. And I think that's great because that can be a reminder to you to take a look at them. But, it's really a big advantage if you can actually access these things on your own when you have time or when you're interested in how your revenue cycle management is going. So, in addition to aging, of course, you want to look at your denials. What's the has that increased? Is it increasing? And also, are there common reasons that keep propping up? This is another reason why you have to have really good communication between the billing service and your practice team, because maybe there's one provider that keeps actually having missing documentation or other kind of coding mistakes. Maybe the billing service doesn't feel comfortable contacting the provider directly, or you don't want them to do so potentially. Collaboration and making sure you have access to reports and understand how to read them is really important so you can head off problems like that and stop them from repeating. Collections, you want to keep an eye on how much they're collecting and how quickly is it coming in. That's your payment velocity. How quickly are both your claims, how quickly is the actual billing process of sending things out to the clearinghouse, and then the actual billing to the payer, and then also the actual collection of the money. How quickly are all those things happening? And your report should be able to tell you all of these things. Now, if you're switching systems, another really important thing to keep in mind is that you'll need some training on using these reports, reading them, and if you're going to be running them yourself, also how to run them. You may also have a system now if you're making a change, or if you already have a great system, you may have a system that allows you to do custom reporting and download things into Excel so that you can do some extra analysis. So making sure that you know how to do those things, or will know how, or will be trained on how to do those things, is really important. And you just need to know, is that training going to come from the billing service, or is it going to come from the technology vendor? If, in fact, the billing service isn't affiliated with a technology platform, will they get you hooked up with the technology company so that you can get the training that you need? The other thing that you really want to understand is, what does the billing service consider great performance on their part? I mean, what are the goals that they are reaching for? How are they evaluating their own performance every month? In other words, what benchmarks are they using? You want to know how they're grading themselves and how they're challenging themselves to do the very best possible job for you.
That's interesting. So you should ask them about their own internal benchmarks as they relate to your practice.
Definitely, and if it's a larger service, they may have benchmarks that all the billers in the service are trying to meet, or maybe they even have a little bit of competition going on, internally, and
sure.
That's something that can be helpful to you. But most important, you want to know what are the kinds of things that they're watching out for to make sure they're staying on track. So, like, one thing I think is really important to ask them about is, how long does it take them from the time that a chart note is signed to getting that bill out the door, at least to the clearinghouse, and then start the process of actually submitting that claim. So we like to say that ideally that happens within 24 hours, right? With if your system's integrated, the provider can sign off on the billing information inside the EHR, should come over to the practice management / billing system immediately, and then we like to see within 24 hours that that claim being prepared and sent through to the clearinghouse. Now, 48 hours would be okay. That's kind of our outside boundary, if you will. But ideally, that stuff happens within 24 hours. That's an example of a benchmark that you can ask your billing service about.
So here's a great question, and it's one of those that's true across life. But is this one of those issues where you want to look for the lowest price possible, or what are the trade-offs around price that you need to think about?
I love this question too, because I think it's everyone's first instinct to say, "Oh my gosh, well, I'm just going to compare the prices and I want to go for the lowest price possible." But remember that sometimes you get what you pay for. If you are looking for the lowest possible percentage of your revenue to be paid to your RTM vendor, then that may mean that they have less incentive to work hard on your claims than they might with another practice. So, for example, if you're really pushing the billing service to drop down a point off of their standard rate, keep in mind that if you're only one of several or one of many practice clients, then that's going to make your business every month look a little bit less attractive to them. So, ultimately, it's not that one percentage number, that fee number isn't what really matters. What matters is what ends up in the bank every month, right? So if by paying an extra point, you get $100,000 extra in the bank at the end of the year, that might be a worthwhile trade-off, right? So,
absolutely.
It's just something to think through very carefully and to model out. And so we all want to negotiate the best deal, but just remember that the billing service has overhead to pay too, and they have people to pay, and if you are, the hardest and least profitable practice that they work with, that may not work in your favor ultimately in terms of your collections and the cash that ends up in your bank account.
That's a great point. What about the size of the service? Do you need some large company to do this, or what's the considerations around that?
So this is another question that comes up a lot with our practice clients, and our answer, my partners and I always say that there are excellent billing services of pretty much every stripe. We've worked with practices that have used a single solo contractor, working on her own out of her house, and it's worked out really well for them. We've worked with practices that have worked with RCM organizations that are attached to technology vendors, kind of like our sponsor, and that can work out really, really well. I mean, there are basically good services of every variety, but you want to make sure that you understand what the trade-offs are, and also make sure that you have a good fit and that you are, you're clear about what your expectations are. They're clear about what their expectations are in terms of getting information and help from you, and that there's good communication and good fit. So I guess the bottom line here is I wouldn't exclude a particular option just because it's it's only a small vendor, or it's not they don't have a nationwide team. Or I wouldn't say, I'm only going to go with, or I'm going to exclude the larger vendors and only look at, smaller ones. Each model has its advantages. For example, if you work with a billing service that's tied to a technology platform, first of all, that can be really advantageous if you're just starting out, because it's usually easier to get started. They have their own tech team, and there are plenty of people there to help you, and of course they know the technology really, really well. But the downside there is that maybe you're going to be as important to them, right? Well, I mean, that maybe you'll be important to them, but you're not going to crush their business if you leave, right? Whereas if you're working with a solo biller, well, this person may not have all the technology knowledge, and they may not have maybe they're not a certified coder. However, they may be very, very knowledgeable and experienced, and of course they'll be really dependent on your business. And many times they work with great technology platforms. More and more of the tech platforms are helping billers out to offer great RCM services. So it's really a matter of understanding what your own needs are, understanding your own expectations, and making sure that they're really aligned, and that you're getting, that you're getting all the things that you need. So, if you need great technology, you don't have that yet, you've got to prioritize that. If you're in a really, narrow specialty, and you really feel like you need someone who has experience with that, then you've got to prioritize that. And, the environment in which you get it doesn't necessarily matter as much, as long as you're making sure to get, that what you need is on the table.
So of course, so much of this is really, the whole presentation has been this in a way, but I think it's good to kind of circle around and summarize, and then add some new information as well. What are some other pitfalls and best practices in choosing an RCM partner?
Yeah, so this is big, because this is my chance to just throw in all the other things that I haven't had a chance to say yet.
Right.
So at least as many of them as I can. So, when you're making a switch to a new service, either switching from one to the other, or going to outsourcing for the first time, make sure you know what kind of training and help with your conversion you're going to get. So, a conversion, a revenue cycle, a practice management system conversion is usually not as thorny as an EHR conversion, but there's still, there's still a technical element to it, and you want to make sure you're working with a partner that can help you understand what you have to do, and make sure that the conversion goes smoothly, and that you can help you set the timeline and everything that you need to know to make sure that there isn't an interruption in your revenue. And as I was mentioning with the reporting, you're going to need to have training too, right? You're going to need to understand how the system works, not just for getting your reports, but also for your front office team for posting payments, for example, for looking things up, for getting statements, for patients that need them. And also, if you're thinking about doing some of those add-on technologies that I mentioned early on, that's something else that you'll need to make sure that will require, basically, that your front office staff is really well versed in the system. So you need to know who's going to provide that training and who's going to help you with the conversion. Is it the billing service itself, or are they going to have to connect you up with someone as a technology vendor if, in fact, they're not the same company? And then, of course, you want to make sure that you are not afraid to ask questions if anything at all is confusing. I mean, I think if you haven't gone through it before, the process of switching can be a little bit overwhelming, and you may feel like, I don't, is this a dumb question or what have you? You know what, if you have something that you need to know or if anything confuses you, it's really, really important to just ask it. Odds are good that someone else has asked it before and that it's not a silly question. But more importantly, you have to feel totally comfortable and like you understand how you're going to move forward when you're choosing a new service and starting to work with them. This is something, these last two bullet items actually are really important. I think it's very, very critical that you retain control over your contracts with your payers. Too often we see practices contracting with the billing service, and as part of that, idea that, oh, well, now I don't have to worry about that. The billing service starts receiving all of the amendments and all of the mail notifications from the payer, and then you may not realize that a contract is actually expiring or it's automatically rolling over. Now, the billing service may just assume that you want to let the contract roll over, but you may not, or maybe you have other ideas, or maybe you want to do some really thorough analysis of what, comparing different payers, because you may feel like you want to drop one or more payers that are, not performing well or are leading to a lot of patient complaints. So, you need to really collaborate on this. The other thing is that, when it comes to negotiating your contract, so usually there's a narrow window each year, right, when your contract is expiring and you have an opportunity to go back to that payer and try to change up the terms or get a better reimbursement rate. And so if you miss that window, then you're going to wait a whole another year again. And, that's something really that inside the practice, your administrators, managers, and physician owners should be keeping an eye on and maintaining control over. The input from the billing service is going to be really valuable in that process, but they still may not know all that you know about the local market and about what you're bringing to the table, versus other practices in your specialty. And so they won't have all of the ammunition, if you will, that you will have for negotiating your contract. So you want to make sure that you're staying on top of that. It's super important. One last thing about that. The contracts that renew automatically, many times they will be pegged to, say, 2015 Medicare. You're getting a certain percentage of 2015 Medicare. Well, now you're rolling over into 2016 and you're still pegged to the prior year's Medicare, or worse, we've seen contracts that have rolled over 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years, and the practice basically hasn't gotten a raise because they didn't realize that the contract didn't, include, because of course it didn't, right? the payer did not write it in a way that, automatically gave you a raise, and so you've missed out on that. That's called evergreen language, and it can mean that your practice basically automatically gets a haircut when your contract rolls over. So
and that's got to be quite a haircut if you miss a couple years. I mean, it wouldn't take that long before you're really missing out.
Well, it can make a big difference. I mean, I guess fortunately, I'm saying with air quotes, payers aren't giving giant raises,
Right.
these days. So, it's not like it's, a huge money for every procedure, but every little bit counts, and you should be getting, what everyone else is getting, basically.
Right.
So
And those rates are
they're
changing
better.
all the time, and now there's all this
Yeah,
quality reporting that's going to start going into it, and my goodness, that's a great point.
absolutely. So, and you know what? You may be able to negotiate. Many times practices assume they can't, but you may be able to, but you can't do it if you let that window go by. So I always advise practices to set up a tickler, put it in your calendar when all your different contracts expire, and maintain control of that. Get input from the billing service because they may also have some good scuttlebutt about a particular payer. But, you have to work together to prepare for the negotiations and just make sure that you are maintaining control of it. And then the last thing I just want to say is that payer directories, oh my goodness, honestly, I could do an entire presentation just on this, but they're becoming such a problem because there are so many errors. And literally every practice we work with has, as soon as we look, we find that there are errors in the payer directories, and providers are not listed that should be, providers are listed that shouldn't be, providers are listed as accepting new patients when they're not, or vice versa. Addresses are out of date. I mean, the variety of errors that can happen is almost infinite, and they really have a powerful effect on both your practice and your patients, because if you're not listed in a directory for a payer that you accept, then you're basically turning those patients away when they go to look and see who's in network. And then on the flip side, if you're listed and you shouldn't be, a patient may accidentally come and be seen out of network and then end up with a big bill. So the directories, you got to make sure that you maintain oversight of that, and ideally you have people in your practice working bit by bit on that, and don't leave that to your billing service unless this is something that you've worked out with them contractually. But I feel like it's so important, and it's kind of an oddball, in the realm of billing. I don't really think it's a natural fit with their work, and so I feel like it's much better to retain that responsibility inside the practice and have people on your team that are just tasked with checking those directories every few months to make sure that there aren't any errors. And believe me, even when it looks right now, it's entirely possible you can go back in 6 months and there will be an error. So you really have to have a process for just periodically checking those directories and making sure that things have not gone wrong.
It's so easy to see how people could overlook checking on those, because who would usually think of that? But you raise great points about how important it is to do that.
It's easy to overlook, and it's another thing that really shouldn't be your job,
Right.
but since it affects you,
But if you don't do
ultimately,
it, no one else is going to.
exactly,
Right.
exactly.
Well, Lori, I have to say this has been a fantastic presentation. I really think there's so much valuable information you've shared with our audience. I can't thank you enough for presenting with us today.
Oh my gosh, it was totally my pleasure.
Well, it was our pleasure. So if people want to learn more about your services, they can go to www.capco.com. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And then our sponsor is Care 360, and they provide revenue cycle management services themselves. Isn't that true?
It is. Are they on the line? Yeah, it is. That is correct.
Well, I don't know if our sponsors want to speak up and just explain how they can help people with this as well. We are going to be sending up a follow-up email after this learning lunch where we will answer any of your written questions, include a copy of the slides, include the video recording of this event, but visit care360.com to learn more about their options, and then you'll also be receiving follow-up information from them as well. So we thank them for their sponsorship of this event. Again, really fantastic information. These learning lunches are always free at formatapproved.com. So if you go to our webpage, you can always register for these events. We try to hold them on a regular basis. And then remember that we also provide training in meaningful use, PQRS, HIPAA compliance through our training store at formattraining.com. So we are out of time, but Lori, I want to thank you again for such a great session. I really learned a lot today, and I loved it.
Oh, thank you so much, Brian. I really enjoyed it too.
All right. Have a great day, everyone, and join us for our next learning lunch. Bye now.
Bye-bye.